All right, so I'm going to do screen share and share. Oops. All right, and then, there it is. All right, do you see Dear Church Part 3?
Yes.
Yes, great, fabulous. Okay, so we'll start off with a recap of Part 2. We covered 3 chapters last week. The first chapter that we covered was about reparations. And Lenny Duncan's definition of reparations are making the broken whole. And he talks about how we as a church are a church that begins worship with public confession of admitting all the ways in which we have fallen short of God's intention for us. And the church as a denomination has publicly repented of racism, but he says, after we make repentance, before reconciliation can happen, there needs to be some sort of process of reparations. And what he suggests for the ELCA is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in which bishops would listen to people of color share stories about the ways they have experienced discrimination within the church. And he doesn't say this next part, but my recommendation is, after I shared all the just some of the stories of racism that I know of in the church, and I suggested to you a way to be a part of the solution is when your pastor comes to you and says, hey, there's a committee that the synod is putting together to work on such and such a thing, would you be willing to serve? That you might be open to saying yes, so that you can be a part of changing those systems. And then the next chapter that we covered last week was about Dylan Roof. And as a reminder, he was a young man who was raised in a Lutheran congregation who showed up to a Bible study at an African-American church one Wednesday evening and killed 9 people in an attempt to start a race war. And so Lenny Duncan goes through the chapter showing a lot of parallels between his own life and Dylan Roof's life. And he asks us some questions. One is, how do we make sense of news stories? What we see going on television, we can interpret in different ways. Dylan Roof interpreted the death of Trayvon Martin and the critique that the killer received for killing Trayvon Martin as a threat to white folks. And so that's how we interpreted that story. And an invitation for us to reflect around what meaning do we make of the stories that we hear, and how do we help others make meaning of those stories. And so he also says, look, the Lutheran Church loves our intellectual heritage. And so we love to talk about Luther's writing of addressing the problems 500 years ago, but he says we need to be willing to talk about how our theology addresses modern problems, not just the problems of the Renaissance and Middle Ages. And then he ends by talking about this poignant moment where he and his wife realized that as he becomes a pastor who will likely serve in a church of color, that if another shooter came in and killed the pastor leading a Bible study, that would be him. And it speaks to this recognition that people of color have to live every day with a level of fear not experienced by white folks in this country. And then the third chapter, he talks about the ways in which our symbols and rituals reinforce white supremacy in our church. And so he talked about white hooded robes. And he talked about how when he would bring up to his seminary professors the fact that white hooded robes were a stark reminder to him of the KKK and made him feel unsafe as a Black man, they would dismiss him. And he actually mentions that when he published online about white hooded robes, ELCA pastors made death threats to Lenny Duncan for critiquing this. And then I took you on my own personal journey of me saying, look, white robes, they're ancient. They precede all this black and white racial imagery that's not developed until the 1600s. And I talked about how in modern day Africa they're used, and I say, oh, there's all these historical contexts in which white robes aren't a problem. And then I said, but at the end of the day, here in the United States, white robes have been used to terrorize people of color. And so we have to recognize that here in this country, in this moment of history, the wearing of white robes is a stumbling block to people of color receiving the gospel in our congregation. And so that I can be accountable to you all, I have sent on the recording of that along with the PDF of this chapter to our worship committee so that they can read it and talk about it. And we're moving to outside worship, and I won't wear robes anyway because it's crazy hot. But at the end of August, there's an opportunity, as I read through the scriptures that I'll be preaching on, an opportunity in which the scriptures will easily help me talk about this. And so that'll be my opportunity to talk with the congregation about why we need to stop wearing white hooded robes at the church. So hold me accountable to that. If August passes and I don't do it, say, hey, pastor, what happened? Lenny Duncan also talks about how Advent, when it's talked about in terms of moving from darkness to light, reinforces the idea that people who are dark are bad and people who are light are good. And he suggests, there's lots of other Advent imagery you can use. The waiting to give birth. Fun fact, in Spanish, to give birth literally is dar luz, which is to give light. But once again, that's not our context. So, and then he talks about depicting Jesus as Northern European white Jesus and the ways in which when, as a young boy growing up, he only saw Jesus depicted as white. And so he felt like, oh, this Jesus has nothing to do with me because he doesn't look like me. And not only that, the Jesus that he saw portrayed looked a lot like people who frequently told him he didn't matter because he had dark skin. And so calling on us to have dark skin depictions of Jesus. All right, so that's a recap of last week. This week, we're going to talk about intersectionality briefly. He doesn't actually talk about intersectionality, but we started reading this book to talk about systemic racism, and then we get 2 chapters on gender and sexuality, and we may think to ourselves, wait, that's not what we're supposed to be talking about. And so this is why he's doing it. He doesn't say it explicitly, but to say, after there were movements in the 20th century around feminism, quickly it became apparent to some women that white feminists had a different experience than Black feminists or Latina feminists. And so they started to say, hey, wait a minute, the term feminist can't cover every experience of womanhood. And so they started to say, we need to talk about the ways in which our identity isn't just one thing, that our identity is many things, and that the ways in which our race, our gender, our socioeconomic status, our education level, our religion, all these things define us, and they overlap in our society in ways that privilege some people more than others. So Lenny Duncan is a Black man, and he's going to have a different experience in the world than a Black woman. But he'll also talk about the fact that he is a queer Black man. So he finds men attractive, as well as finding women attractive. And he says he finds transsexual people attractive as well. And so he will have an even further different experience than a straight Black man. He's also a Black man, a queer Black man who's gone to seminary. And so that will give him a different level of access and privilege than other queer Black men. So So he's going to touch on these other aspects of his identity so that to help us think about, oh, wait, right? We can't just look at one category by itself without thinking about how it connects with these other categories. All right, so the first thing, this chapter is called The Church is Queer. And his statement on this is to say, first and foremost, there are queer people in your church. So he's saying, right, there are gay people in your church, there are lesbian people in your church, there are transgendered people in your church, there are all sorts of folks who don't fit into the heteronormative category. He's saying they're already there, whether or not you know it. So the church is already queer. And he's saying this is not a not modern phenomenon. He says it's not the 21st century. He's like, this is before Luther, this is before Paul. And what he says is it goes back to the Ethiopian eunuch. Now, I'm not confident everyone knows who the Ethiopian eunuch is, so I'm going to tell you about him because it's a fabulous story in the Bible that everyone should know. So the first thing you have to know is what a eunuch is. And Deuteronomy 23:1 helpfully defines a eunuch is someone whose testicles are crushed or whose penis is cut off. And eunuchs were very common in the ancient world. They were common for a couple reasons. One, they were common for soldiers, because if you wanted an army of soldiers who you were pretty confident wouldn't want to take power for themselves to pass on to their kids, you make sure they don't have kids. And that way they have no incentive to pass on power to anyone. The second reason eunuchs were common in the ancient world is to take care of noble women. So you have a queen, and you want to make sure that she has servants to take care of her needs and that she's got strong men to protect her. But you don't want her sleeping with those men. So you turn them into eunuchs. And yeah, so that's what a eunuch is. Deuteronomy 23:1 says very explicitly, no one whose testicles are crushed or whose penis is cut off shall be admitted into the assembly of the Lord. And so Lenny Duncan, what he's trying to say here is, right, in our understanding of heteronormativity, a eunuch would be considered queer. They don't fit the heteronormative definition of what a man is. And he's saying, right, so he doesn't talk about Deuteronomy 23. What I'm going to tell you is there is a point in the Bible in which it says eunuchs should not be included in the church, should not be included in God's people. But then in Isaiah, which is written centuries later, there's a slight shift in God's language. For thus says the Lord, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbath, who choose the things that please me, and hold fast my covenant, I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. So whereas Deuteronomy 23 said, no eunuchs, we don't want them, Isaiah says, well, someday there will be eunuchs and they will follow my commandments, and then I will give to them a monument better than sons and daughters, right? I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. And there's some great eunuch puns in there, right? So, right, they won't have progeny of sons and daughters. They'll have progeny of a monument of an everlasting name. And eunuchs had something cut off, but their name won't be cut off. So Isaiah has this promise for eunuchs. And then we see in Acts, the followers of Jesus make this promise a reality. So Philip is led by the Holy Spirit down a road, and there was an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official of the Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of her entire treasury. So let's pause for a moment, and we can do some conversation here at this point. If we're going to go back to our topic of intersectionality, right? what intersections does an Ethiopian eunuch who's working for the queen and in charge of her treasury, like what sort of intersections is this person dealing with?
Well, you've got ethnicity and class as well as gender things.
Yeah, so we might think, okay, on a gender level, the eunuch is seen as a low status. But because he's working for the queen, he's got a high status. And because he's controlling all the money of a nation, he's also got really high status. Now, he's also ethnically an outsider within Judaism. And so that would put him down in low status again. Exactly. So he's got these different intersections. Yep. And it says he had come to Jerusalem to worship. Now, from reading Deuteronomy 23, if a eunuch shows up at the temple to worship, is he going to be let in? No, right? Explicitly, no eunuchs allowed. So he's just gone to Jerusalem to worship. And when you go to Jerusalem to worship, you go to worship in the temple. So he's literally just been rejected because he's a eunuch. And yet he was reading the prophet Isaiah. What do we know about the prophet Isaiah? The prophet Isaiah promises eunuchs will have a place in God's assembly. And so Philip runs up and says, do you understand what you're reading? And he says, how can I unless someone guides me? And so the eunuch invites Philip to sit, and they read Isaiah together, and they read this passage that talks about a sheep being led to the slaughter. And the eunuch asks Philip, so like, what's this passage talking about? And Philip explains, Isaiah is promising that his prophecies will be fulfilled in Jesus. And so the eunuch says, wait a minute, if Jesus is the fulfillment of Isaiah's promise, then does that mean there's a place for me in God's assembly? And he says, look, here is water. What is to prevent me from being baptized? And he commanded the chariot to stop, and both of them, Philip and the eunuch, went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. So Lenny Duncan is going to say this is the first instance of a queer member of the church. And in fact, the Ethiopian eunuch goes off and he evangelizes in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is the second oldest Christian nation in the world. Georgia is the only older Christian nation. Or maybe it's Armenia. Anyway, Ethiopia is the second oldest Christian nation in the world. And it's because of a eunuch who at one point was denied access to God's people and God's assembly. But Jesus is the promise of inclusion, is the fulfillment of that promise for inclusion to people who don't fit into, making babies. All right, so the church is queer. So, but today, there are still lots of ways into which the LGBTQ community asks the question, what is to prevent me from being baptized? And the church comes up with all sorts of answers. And Lenny Duncan says, at its core, the reason why the church excludes so many people around issues of sexuality is because we have a harmful sexuality theology. And Lenny Duncan is going to argue that it goes back to Paul. Because Paul believed the world was about to end at any moment. Jesus was about to come back. And so he thought there's no point in worrying about having sex or procreating. Just focus on getting ready for Jesus to come back. And I tried to get the pastor who officiated on Lisa and my wedding to preach on this text, 1 Corinthians 7. And I just picked out one verse, but the whole chapter is like this. Paul says, so then he who marries his fiancée does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do better. So Paul's whole thing is like, look, being married's terrible. you can't focus on God because you got to focus on pleasing your spouse. It's just a waste of time. Don't do it. But he's like, but if like you got these uncontrollable urges, fine, get married. Which is not like a joyous celebration of our sexuality. And Lenny Duncan's going to argue that that attitude of sex is sort of this inconvenient, necessary evil that we have to get married to like confine to a safe place. He's going to argue that that has created a culture of shame and silence around sexuality in general, for straight folks as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the next thing he mentions is candidacy committees. And Lenny has this habit, because he's writing this to the ELCA, he assumes you understand every part of the ELCA. So he just mentions briefly candidacy committees. And you need to understand what these are, because these are one of the most important gatekeepers in the church. So when someone thinks to themselves, I want to be a pastor, what they do is they go to their own pastor and say, hey, I want to be a pastor. I did this. And the pastor says, great. Here's the paperwork that you fill out. And then you send it into the synod. And the synod has what's called a candidacy committee. And the candidacy committee's job is to spend 4 to 5 years with each person who's considering seminary or considering becoming a pastor. They spend 4 to 5 years continually interviewing and assessing the candidates, the people who want to become pastors, to see, is this person really fit to be a pastor? And this is separate from seminary, because anyone who wants to can pay the seminary money to take their classes. The seminary will gladly take your money to teach you. And I know that they've gladly taken the money of many people who candidacy committees have said, nope, you won't be a pastor. And so, whereas seminary is an academic training, the candidacy committee is looking at your moral character. Does that make sense? Now, as you might imagine, candidacy committees are made up of people. And different people in different places focus on different things. But one of the things for 19 years that every candidacy committee was supposed to use to determine someone's fitness to be a pastor was a document called Vision and Expectations. In 1990, well, I guess in the late 80s, the church was realizing, hey, there are gay people in our churches. And it was largely the AIDS epidemic that made us realize there are gay people in our churches. And it occurred to us that, oh, some of these folks may want to become pastors. And so we didn't, as a denomination, we didn't have a policy on could a gay person become a pastor? And so we said, well, let's come up with a policy, because, and honestly, right, the reason the church said we need a policy is because the church had no grounds to prevent gay people from becoming pastors. And the church thought to itself, we should have a way to prevent gay people from becoming pastors. And so they came up with this document called Vision and Expectations. But of course, the church didn't want to just have a document that existed solely for the purpose of preventing gay people from becoming pastors. And so the idea was Vision and Expectations would lay forth all the expectations that a pastor, any pastor, will be expected to conform to. And so, you know, it's like 20 pages long, but in truth, there was one paragraph that was always the question people really cared about. And it's, what are you doing with your sexuality? Initially, it explicitly said people who are, you know, gay or lesbian are expected to remain celibate. And for everyone else, it said, you are expected to remain chaste. And then what candidacy committees would do is they would say, have you read, and they said this to me, have you read Vision and Expectations? Of course, if you want to get approved, you say yes. And they say, are you able to abide by visions and expectations and live your life in accordance with vision and expectations. And of course, if you want to get ordained, you nod your head and you say yes. Right, some candidacy committees will leave it at that, but some candidacy committees like to dig and be like, so tell me the details. And people who are more obviously in the LGBTQ community tend to get more questions asked. Women tend to get more questions asked than men. I know women in seminary who were hounded for having a boyfriend come and visit them on internship. I will tell you, my girlfriend visited me monthly while I was on internship. No one batted an eye. So in 2000, well, yeah. So vision and expectations officially this year ceased to be a governing document of the church. Before this year, there were changes to it to remove the language explicitly about homosexuality, but it was still continued to be used to inquire into the sexual life of candidates. And sometimes in ways like, for me, appropriately, just like, you know, behave yourself. And then sometimes in ways that were very abusive and intrusive. And right now, our denomination is struggling with this question to say, you know, as a denomination, we want to hold pastors to a standard where you don't want to see your pastor like cruising around picking up sexual partners every night. Yeah, so there's sort of the struggle of, you know, what do we actually expect of pastors right now? So we don't really have a document to replace vision and expectations yet, but they're working on it. You may be asked to fill out a survey at some point about what you think pastors should do with their sex lives. So candidacy committees are one of the gatekeepers, and you have to get 3 times you have to go before your candidacy committee and have them approve you before you can get ordained. So this isn't a one-time thing. Before you apply to seminary, while you're in seminary, and right before you graduate from seminary, the candidacy committee checks to make sure they feel like you're an appropriate person. And I will say, you know, if you bracket questions around homosexuality, every time a candidacy committee has told one of my friends, you shouldn't be a pastor, I have agreed with the candidacy committee. I think for the most part, they're very good at saying, like, God has given you other gifts. But particularly for LGBTQ people, candidacy committees have been very intrusive. And even for the folks who get ordained, candidacy committees can be quite abusive as well. You may be asked at one point if you would like to serve on a candidacy committee. I encourage you to say yes. All right, so the next thing are call committees. We have Greg Massa on this call. He was part of the call committee that brought me here. Call committees' jobs are to interview potential pastors and to recommend one to the congregation. And like candidacy committees, call committees can vary greatly depending on the people who are on them. And once again, I know of call committees that have asked very personal and intrusive questions into people's lives. And often call committees, you know, will dismiss outright people of color or LGBTQ folks. I myself had an interesting moment with our call committee, and I am very grateful for their response. I came to this congregation recently divorced. And so I said to the call committee, you know, I was upfront with them about that. And I said, look, I hope at some point to be married again. And there's going to be, you know, a process between me being single and getting married. And Greg Massa said, are you asking us for permission to date? And I said, no, I'm telling you I'm going to date, and I want to know how you would feel about seeing your pastor on a date. And I don't think he's on the call, but Dave Rush, who is an older gentleman in our congregation, a retired lawyer, he leaned back in his chair and he stroked his chin. And he said, if I saw my pastor out on a date, I'd feel proud. Right? In that moment, I was like, this is the congregation for me. Praise be to God. But to say that conversation could have gone very differently, right? Imagine had I been a woman, I can imagine that some people would feel differently about seeing their female pastor out on a date. Had I been gay, I can imagine people would feel very differently about seeing me out on a date. And so, right, those biases within call committees are present. And what Lenny Duncan says is, even though our denomination, and we'll talk about this in a moment, has said we are open to the ordination of LGBTQ people, there is nothing in our denomination that prevents discrimination on a call committee level. And there's very little that prevents discrimination on a candidacy committee level. So while our denomination may say we're open to the ordination of gay and lesbians and transgendered people, it can be very difficult for those people to actually navigate the system and first be ordained and then be called to a congregation. And so the fourth thing that Lenny Duncan talks about is what he calls a dog whistle of the phrase, the 2009 decision. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the term dog whistle, the term dog whistle refers to a phrase that's used when you want to talk about something without naming it explicitly. And so in this case, when people want to talk about our denomination's decision to allow for the ordination of LGBTQ folks, but they don't want to say that, they'll use the phrase 2009 decision, because in 2009, we had a church-wide assembly. Church-wide assemblies happen, I believe, every 2 years, or maybe every 3 years. And what happens is, as a congregation, we send people to a synod assembly every year. The synod assembly then elects people from the synod assembly to send to the church-wide assembly every 3 years. And at the church-wide assembly, that is the highest decision-making body of our denomination. And it was at that assembly that we made the decision to change our understanding of human sexuality and to change our documents around the rules of ordination to allow for the ordination of LGBTQ folks. It required, there was 1,000 people at that assembly, and it was required to pass by a 2/3 majority. The decision passed with a vote of 667 votes yes. That is exactly the number of votes that it needed to pass. Exactly. And so what Lenny Duncan talks about is there are people in our denomination who feel that decision has led to a decline in numbers within our denomination. And it is true that there were many congregations that left the ELCA following that vote. And it is true that many congregations lost parishioners following that vote. But what Lenny Duncan will say is, look, the decline in church attendance has been happening for decades, and it's happening in every denomination. And so what he says is, there are folks within our denomination who would like to blame lower attendance on our welcome of LGBTQ folks. And he's saying, like, one, it's not true that that's the reason. And two, right, that is a dog whistle. That is a way in which the church continues to marginalize and discriminate against LGBTQ people without outright saying it, but to blame LGBTQ people and to blame the welcome of LGBTQ people for decreased attendance. Okay, any questions about what I've talked about so far?
What you said about the standards that they used to ask, I was at a Senate Assembly way before, like in the 90s, the early part of this century, and they were voting for a bishop.
Yeah.
And I was with a couple pastors who had spent their entire, before they came to California, their entire ministry in the Midwest. And the comment was, I can't believe that the candidates are saying they're looking forward to a day that they can marry a gay couple.
Oh.
And then I was confused because we accept gay people in our congregations. What was the objection of making them pastors? And they explained to me that, well, there's singing the standards that you sign a pledge when you graduate from seminary that you won't have sex outside of marriage. And I thought there was a perfectly good solution to that. We work with the civil law to make marriage legal civilly, and then we don't have that problem.
And so, Darlene, that's actually what happened in 2009, right?
I know, but this was before that, obviously.
Sure. But I think, right, this goes back to the theologies of sexuality that Lenny Duncan was talking about, where before we could, as a denomination, say we were willing to ordain gay and lesbian folks who weren't celibate, first we as a denomination had to say in 2009, we will come up with a liturgy to officiate gay and lesbian weddings. We had to first say, as a church, we can endorse the marriage of gay and lesbian people. And only after that statement could we say, we will ordain gay and lesbian people because of our concern for making sure our pastors don't have sex outside of marriage.
And then we stopped saying marriage is one man and one woman.
Yes.
Even though Jacob certainly had plenty of children by many different women.
Yeah, that's certainly not the biblical understanding of marriage. Yeah. All right. Any other questions about what I've covered so far? All right, we'll move on then. Okay, so he references some of these things briefly, but I figured I'd tell you more about them. He talks about, so there are some positive movements within the ELCA. There's an organization called Reconciling Works. He refers to it as Lutherans Concerned North America. They recently changed their name to Reconciling Works, which is why there's that discrepancy. And they're an organization that works for the full inclusion of LGBTQ people within our denomination. And what they're most famous for is having congregations state officially that they are a reconciling in Christ congregation. Now, why would you have a reconciling in Christ congregation? So in 2009, we as a denomination said, we have now a liturgy to officiate gay and lesbian weddings. We no longer have prohibitions against gay and lesbian people who are in committed relationships from being ordained. But the church also came up with this idea of what's called a bound conscience. And so what it said is, although the church is now permitting the ordination of gay and lesbian people, the church cannot demand congregations to accept gay and lesbian people. To say, while the denomination has no prohibition against officiating same-sex weddings, the denomination can't tell pastors or congregations that they have to have same-sex weddings at their church. Does that distinction make sense?
Is that still the policy, or has that changed?
That is still the policy. And while the document in 2009 came up with a sort of a theological justification for that, on a structural denominational structure level, our denomination has no power to enforce it anyway, even if we said everyone should. Right? The bishop can't call me up and tell me I have to officiate anyone's wedding. And just like the call committee at the end of the day had the last word about which pastor they were going to call to faith. At the end of the day, the call committee can say, we don't like that pastor. It's not because they're gay, it's just because we don't like them. And the bishop can't say, well, no, you have to take that pastor. And so there's no way to actually force congregations to do this, but the 2009 document came up with a theological justification, which says we respect each person's bound conscience. Like if there's a community within the ELCA that feels, according to our conscience, we can't allow a same-sex wedding to happen in our congregation, the denomination says fine. And so because of that, Lenny Duncan will critique, he says that 2009 sexuality statement is actually violence to the LGBTQ community, because it doesn't actually affirm us. It just says the denomination isn't actively going to go after us. And so within our denomination, Reconciling Works encourages local congregations to say, we are a reconciling in Christ congregation, which is essentially a way for us to communicate to the broader world. This is a congregation that says, yes, actually, we fully welcome the LGBTQ community. We would gladly do same-sex weddings at our church. We're open to calling an LGBTQ pastor to say, we really do want to fully welcome that community into our congregation. And Lenny Duncan points out only 10% of ELCA congregations are reconciling in Christ. So while our denomination may say, we've got no problem, there are plenty of congregations who say, well, maybe we locally have a problem, or maybe we're not comfortable publicly stating that we welcome folks. And right, Faith Lutheran Church went through that process before I arrived. I'm very grateful Faith Lutheran Church did, but it took a lot of work. I know Carolyn Keys was a big part of that. Carolyn, would you like to share any about what that took? Or Bill? I don't know if Carolyn's around.
She's not around.
Oh.
Yeah, there were some people who wanted to go through it very, very quickly. And we followed the model of Good Shepherd in Reno. We suggested that we needed to hear the stories of people who were involved in the congregation, both gay, lesbian, LGBTQIA people, but also members of the congregation who had stories to share. So we spent the whole summer sharing those stories and having conversation with individuals. We not only had classes in between services, but we also shared the stories in documents that were written. And it was kind of, I think it was really, in some ways, you might say risky for individuals who were public about that. And how would the congregation respond to that? I mean, there had been a long history of Faith Lutheran Church welcoming people. And in fact, the first gay member of the congregation that I know, I suspect there were other gay members, but came from the church that I served in Santa Clara. And he was wondering whether or not Faith would be welcoming of he and his partner when they moved to Chico. So I called Carl Wilfred at that time, and I said, so do you have a sense of welcoming? And Carl said, of course. And so I think the congregation felt that they were already there. And but we didn't disagree with that, but we felt what was more important was to let people who don't know that we were welcoming. Because people who come from the outside and don't know that we are a welcoming congregation, there hasn't been this journey to make that happen. So it took a year for us, I think the congregation had moved through a lot before that time, but this is kind of the ending portion of it for about a year. And we voted in the fall of 2014, I think.
Yeah.
And-
So well after the denominational decision.
Yes.
Yeah, and I appreciate, right, taking the time to actually share those stories, because the last thing we want to do as a congregation is say, oh, we're welcoming, and then have someone come and not experience welcome. And you know, I'm grateful for the work you all did around reconciling in Christ, and you know, to acknowledge we have work to do for folks of color, to say, wait, we want people of color to come and feel welcome. We don't want to say to folks, oh yeah, you're totally great here, and then have them experience something that does not share the gospel. Yeah. All right, so that's a little bit about reconciling works. And when you see our little logo of these hearts and it says reconciling in Christ, that's what that's about. I also want to talk about Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries. It's sometimes called ELM. This developed when gay and lesbian folks in our denomination wanted to get ordained, and suddenly there were rules that prevented them from getting ordained. And they said, okay, if the ordinary process of ordination is to reject people who the Spirit has called, then we need an extraordinary ordination process. And the first three people who were ordained through this extraordinary process were these three folks here. This is exactly 30 years ago last week, this photograph was taken. This is the Pride Parade in San Francisco, and they were the Grand Marshals. Alas, I don't know the two ladies' names. I know this gentleman's name, who's wearing the clerical collar, because he trained me in seminary. His name is Jeff Johnson, and he's the pastor at University Lutheran Chapel in Berkeley. And I'm very grateful for his mentorship. He was the pastor who laid the stole on me at my ordination.
Ruth Frost was the one in the blue.
Oh, thanks, Bill.
And then the middle one, I don't know her first name, but her last name is Zilhart.
Oh, that sounds right, yep. So now, fortunately, there's not needed an extraordinary Lutheran ministry ordination process, but Extraordinary Lutheran Ministry still works to support LGBTQIA folks who are going through the candidacy process, because they know there's still lots of struggles going through that process. All right, so what Lenny Duncan says is what ultimately we need is a new ethical sexual theology. He says, you know, to get us to a place of full inclusion and for healthier lives for heterosexual folks as well. We need a new ethical sexual theology. And he says it needs to be one that teaches young men about consent, that empowers the sacred feminine, and that doesn't leave our members with nowhere to go specifically for questions around sexuality. And he suggests that the church will need to preach about sex, to talk about sex as holy and good, to proclaim that women like sex, that it's not just about men's pleasure, and to affirm that women shouldn't have to dress like they're in a convent to go to church. I've preached about the man who made me want to become a pastor in Milton Freewater, Oregon. His wife, when he told her that he wanted to be a pastor, she broke down and cried because she said, I'll never be able to wear a tank top again. Annalisa, what do you think? Do you worry about being sufficiently modest?
Occasionally.
Yeah, no, it's a real thing.
Yeah.
It still is a real thing, yeah.
Our congregation is very, very accepting and affirming, but yeah, I think about it.
Yeah. All right. And then he talks about the Church Too movement, which is to say in an era where stories are being brought forward about sexual harassment in so many contexts, to acknowledge that it's happening in church contexts as well, and in ELCA contexts as well. All right, and so he suggests we can look for a couple places in Scripture to help us with this new sexual theology. First and foremost, the bodily resurrection of Jesus. Our church teaches that Jesus literally rose with a body from the dead, and the implications of that are that bodies are good, right? The end of God's story isn't to say, you've escaped your body and now you get to be a spirit floating through the universe. God says, no, you get a body, because bodies are how God is going to connect with you, and it's how you're going to connect with other people, and bodies are how you're going to share love. And then he suggests that we should talk about sex and romance in church, so that on your Friday night date, you quote the Song of Solomon. And he suggests you could be quoting this passage. Ah, you are beautiful, my love. Ah, you are beautiful. Your eyes are doves. Ah, you are beautiful, my beloved, truly lovely. He suggests, may we be teaching our church members to speak to each other in such language.
Okay.
And so then I wanted to close this chapter with two current works of sexual theology in the ELCA, one of which I have already mentioned is the document that was produced in 2009, Human Sexuality, Gift and Trust. Lenny Duncan critiques it, rightly so, for saying, hey, whatever your conscience tells you about homosexuality, if you think it's wrong, that's cool. If you think it's right, that's cool. He's like, no, that doesn't actually liberate the LGBTQ community. I will say it does provide some other helpful aspects of thinking about our sexuality. It suggests that what defines a healthy sexual relationship is not the genders of the people involved, and it's not the marital status of the people involved. It's the level of trust between the people involved. And so the whole document is really calling us to say, how do we develop relationships of trust in our sexual relationships, acknowledging that sexual relationships include everything from intercourse to holding hands and hugging someone, and to, even with yourself. So there's some good stuff in there. There's some problematic stuff in there. The biggest problem with it, it's super boring. It's about 70 pages and no one wants to read it. So our most famous Lutheran theologian in the modern era, Nadia Bolz-Weber, has been working on this topic as well. She recently wrote a book called Shameless, a sexual reformation. Our congregation, 2 years ago, took a trip down to Sacramento to hear her read excerpts from it. And she talks about, it starts off with this image of her taking off on a plane and looking down over farmland and seeing these square fields that just have a circle of green in the middle. And it's because of the way they water the crops, where there's essentially a giant sprinkler on wheels that rotates and waters the crops. And she says, it works great for everything that's in those circles, but all the plants that are in the corners don't get watered. And she says, look, our current theology of sexuality might work for the people in the center of that circle, but all the folks who are on those corners aren't getting the theological help that they need to navigate their sexuality. And so she says, we need a new sexual reformation. So yeah, if you're curious on more cutting edge Lutheran sexual theology, that's well written, because she's a very engaging writer. I encourage you to read Nadia's book. Okay, so before we conclude with this chapter, I have a couple questions for you all. One is to say, most people don't come and talk to me about their sex lives. Maybe that's just me as the pastor. I don't know. So we're going to bracket me right now. And I'm going to ask you, have you ever talked to a pastor about your sexuality, your sex life? If so, was it helpful? What was helpful about it? If not, why not?
Hey, Ben. This is Rick. So way back in 1992, when Raquel and I were dating, she was living in a...
Are you telling stories?
I am telling a story.
Yeah, thank you, Greg.
It'll be okay. Don't worry.
Okay.
Way to be brave.
No, so she was living in a house that was sponsored by the Episcopal Church in Santa Barbara. And I remember when her pastor, who was, oversaw the house, Pastor Mark, right?
Tell the story.
Anyway, they were talking about whether it was okay to have boyfriends around, and he said they weren't so much concerned about what we did as long as the power dynamic was equitable.
So, right, that's interesting. That's going kind of our current sexuality statement of what's at stake is the level of trust within the relationship. Yeah. And trust, I will also say, and accountability makes a big point about accountability as well. Yeah. So even in the 90s, okay.
92.
Really nice.
Or 92, yeah. See, it wasn't bad. It wasn't a bad story.
I asked if you could sleep over.
Thank you,
Oh,
Greg.
see, now
Now we're getting details. All right. How about for other folks? Have you had conversations about sex? Maybe not just with your pastor, but in the church?
I don't think so.
Have you ever wanted to?
I have to say, reading this chapter this week, I thought, oh, this could be awkward. So I would have to say that I'm in the category of somebody who I would never want to be a pastor's wife, because I would be worried that I would have to behave a certain way. And so I'm nervous about getting into this kind of conversation and being afraid of saying the wrong thing in church. So, or with respect to, I like very much that Raquel's pastor had the talking about the power dynamic and the trust and that kind of thing. I would not have expected that to be the response necessarily, but.
Yeah, so Karen, you say you'd be afraid of saying the wrong thing. What is your fear of what would happen if you said the wrong thing?
Well, you remember Dana Carvey and the Church Ladies? Pretty much that.
Doesn't he just say, "Isn't that special?"
Well, isn't that special? You think you can talk about sex in church?
Yeah, which isn't the word. Like, okay, so you get scolded.
Yeah, I have an internal barometer that is heavy on the regulation side, as far as being careful not to do something wrong, and that those rules apply twice as much in church as they do everywhere else. It's a pretty strong barometer everywhere. So
Yeah. No, fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
How about other folks?
In not talking about sex at church or whatever, we're supposed to bring our whole selves to church, and by leaving that out, we aren't.
Yeah.
Not that I want to start, but
Well, I think it depends upon. Go ahead. Who's talking?
Oh, it's Jim, Bill.
Hey, Jim. Yeah.
I wrestle with that intimate relationships, and the author of the book does talk to this about trust level. At what point do you go outside that circle of this is a trusted, safe space when you start talking about it? Whatever. I'm not trying to. Well, I would not have. I guess to this day, feel particularly comfortable talking about details of sexuality, just because in my upbringing that was a private matter.
Yeah.
So.
I think that one of the points is that sex has such a broad landscape. So I think what we're talking about is sexual intimacy, and particularly however one engages that. And I don't remember where this story occurred, but it comes from Africa, and it was how the family educated their children in regards to sexuality. And so particularly when it was a male-dominant culture, so when the young man was ready to leave home and to go out into the world, there were a number of things that they were required to journey through. And one was an evening where the child from outside the window would watch the mother and the father engage in sexual intimacy. So I say that in part because I think what we need to do in regards to talking about, the intimacy of sex is to help parents talk with their children about what this is about. And I think that that's one of the areas where we, have fallen short in the church, is to how to help parents engage their children to talk about it. Because, what's the appropriate age? Well, this was in this African community. It was when the young person moved from adolescence to a more adult place in life. So I think that there's some wisdom in that. So.
Yeah, I think there is some wisdom in that. I will say, Coulter and I do try to talk about sexual relations in confirmation. I cannot say how successfully, but yeah, we attempt to. We have 2 parents of confirmation students on this call right now, so I don't. Did your kids mention anything?
No. Amazing. But I was going to say that as a mom to teenage girls, I think that's an important thing. I grew up in the Methodist church in junior high and high school and youth group, and just thinking about some of the things that went on in our unsupervised youth group sometimes, I think it could have been a big help to all of us, and maybe even to our parents who weren't talking about those things. Our household's very open. We talk about it all. You can just ask Kendall, Courtney has a question. I tell Kendall, get in here. We're just going to talk about it all now, and it doesn't matter whose question it is. We're going to answer it with everybody. But my household growing up was not like that, and so I was thinking that my youth group might have been different, might have been some better experiences, if that was more open in our church, and maybe with our parents too, helping our parents as well on how to talk about that.
So let me ask you all one other question, and Annalisa might weigh in on this one. Is to say, I try to model faith and vulnerability and wrestling with sin through talking in many of my sermons about how I struggle with an issue. How would you all feel if I talked about my sex life in a sermon? Doug's like, no. Why not, Doug?
I don't know. So I'm at the age where I grew up in a fairly, probably like Don was saying, my parents were pretty conservative, and so I probably still have some of that. And I think as a society, Americans are probably a little the Puritan, background.
Sure.
But yeah, I don't know. I think I would be more comfortable if you would do small groups like this. If you were to talk about it. But or if you were to tell us, not specifically you, but if there's a biblical story or something.
Yeah.
But, I think small groups, like I would be more comfortable personally to hear you talk about, So anyway.
Yeah, thank you. No, thank you for your honesty. That's what I'm asking. Yeah, and that is helpful to hear. That's to say, maybe some contexts are better than others, and certainly. Oh yeah.
I was going to say I agree with Doug, and I also don't agree with Doug. So I'm going to say two things about it. Before Doug answered, I was going to say that talking about things like the importance of trust and a balance of power in a relationship, I think you could talk in general terms about that without getting into the specifics. Yeah. I think that one of the advantages of doing something in a small group session is that it's more likely that you're going to be able to get a dialogue kind of conversation with people, as opposed to the, I would say the likelihood that you could probably hear a pin drop and a lot of very awkward coughing in the corners of people that just didn't know how to take it and wouldn't feel comfortable saying, why are we having this discussion in a sermon or something?
Yeah.
But I could see ways to do it appropriately.
Can I chime in a little bit?
Sure.
It seems like we're talking a lot about where our comfort level lies, where our upbringing is playing into it, where our own personal shame plays into it. I think we have to start walking boldly into the uncomfortable realm. You have to have uncomfortable sermons. You have to have uncomfortable conversations. If it's about sex, if it's about Black Lives Matter, if it's about sexuality, if it's about gay marriage, you have to start having all those conversations and not start from, well, this makes me uncomfortable, or this makes so-and-so uncomfortable. Because my limited knowledge of Martin Luther, I don't think he ever made anybody in a sermon.
For sure.
Point taken. Point taken.
And for that to be the name of our church, of someone that made everybody uncomfortable, I think we need to walk into the uncomfortable. And when you hear the coughing and you hear the squirming, you lean into it. And that starting maybe with sexuality, because you can deal with that. And then you can lean into even tougher subjects. You can, lean into white privilege. You can lean into Black Lives Matter. But you start dealing with being uncomfortable and knowing you're in a safe place because you guys all love each other. But we can all be uncomfortable together. So maybe not start from what makes me feel uncomfortable. Maybe start with what makes us uncomfortable, and let's start talking about it.
Interesting.
Thank you for that call, Greg.
Yeah, I'm gonna agree with Greg there. I think that was very well stated, and we have a lot of problems in our society that we need to address now, and maybe the church could be a leader on dealing with some of them.
Okay. All right. Well, let's move on to our next topic that maybe the church could be more active in addressing, which is toxic masculinity. So he starts off with sort of a description of toxic masculinity, and he's a very poetic writer, so I've kind of distilled it down to bullet points. But he describes toxic masculinity as a masculinity in which he learned that a man never cries, never shows affection to other men, that a man is tough and takes what he wants. And he ties this into the American dream, that being a man and being American have this same idea of that you seize life and wrestle from it all our hopes and dreams. And he says he had this idea of men owning women, and the ways in which that ownership is expressed is by leering at women, by catcalling women. And he says that when he started reading scripture, he was taught that men are the unquestioned head of a household, and that men take care of their family, and that women are meant to be timid and passive followers of men. So I'm curious for you all, and maybe the men could answer first, and then we could hear from the women. So men, does this understanding of masculinity reflect what you have experienced in your life, of maybe what you were taught or told it meant to be a man?
It's Jim again. I take issue with probably 5 points or more, if not all, of how he defines toxic. Most of the men I know don't hold any of those views, or if they do, I'm not aware of it.
And I would think you would rejoice at that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, if back to Greg's point, if we want to lean into a tough issue, I wonder if that, to some degree, didn't come from his culture.
So he will say explicitly yes, right? He says explicitly, I was living on the street at age 13 by myself as a sex worker. Like, I was in prison, right? My father beat me. So he's like, yeah, this is a really unhealthy understanding of masculinity that he was raised in. And he says it's my call to transcend that. But he wants us to recognize it's not just him who has this, that this permeates many aspects of our culture. And so Jim, what I want to suggest is, you're saying, I don't see that in myself or in my friends. Great. But it's definitely there for a lot of folks.
Oh, no argument there. What I'm trying to say is, I think over the last 40 years, progress has been made on better understanding the role and the character of both men and women, and the ability to cry, ability to give one of your same-sex friends a big hug or say, I love you. I think a lot of that has changed in the last 50 years.
I'm glad to hear that. How about other men? Have you experienced this type of toxic masculinity?
And I'll chime in, and I will agree that I think a lot of us do not hold those values. I think where it does get perpetuated, and I was in the military in all male field, and how men speak by themselves without women around, they encourage it and they accept it. Anybody that's been in a male locker room and been on a team have accepted, if not participated, in behavior they would not participate in open society.
Sure.
And you look at the percentage of people that are homosexual in the world and say that we do not have homosexuals at that same number in NFL football, that we're still dominating that culture. And I think that men will, in a group of men, we do not lift each other up to be better. A lot of times we go to the lowest common denominator so that we are actually accepted as other men. And so we do not shut down toxic attitudes. We do not shut down vulgar characterizations of women. We do it as a group. And I think it still happens on your golf course today.
Yeah, thank you for that, Greg.
I just wanted to add in too, I would agree with Greg. Personally, I had a very loving father who set a good example for me, but I spent 8 years in the military. And then when I got out of the military, I was a deputy sheriff for 15 years in Sonoma County. And at that time, it was mainly male dominated. And particularly in law enforcement, it was almost hyper masculinity. And at some point, with some folks, it really becomes an issue with separating who you are outside of the uniform and what you do as the uniform. And then because of that, in law enforcement, you see a lot of alcoholism. You see a lot of problems in law enforcement that I think or as a result of that conflict on who you are as a person, and then who you're expected to be once you put the badge on. So I agree with Greg on the military.
So thank you. So we've had three men say largely, hey, we've had very positive examples of masculinity in our life that aren't toxic, but maybe in some pockets of these male-dominated fields like locker rooms, sports teams, military, law enforcement, those are present. Now, so I'd love to hear women's perspective. What do you all think? Is this a form of masculinity that you see in the men you know today?
I would say that it in my perception, it is correct and accurate to say that it is a lot better than it was, say, in the 60s and 70s when I was young, when I was a young kid. I would say that there is still an overriding assumption by the society that men take precedence.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, to my mind, that is without question. It is the reason that I think that 4 or 5 years ago, when one of my Black friends wrote something about his son being stopped for the 3rd time by the police when he was trying to do deliveries for his job and lost his job, that I thought, I've never had that experience, but I know that as a woman, I've had experiences that my husband at the time could not understand why I would react the way I would. If there's a group of guys and they're noisy outside of something, what are you talking about that you go to the other side of the street and you try to avoid having any eye contact with them?
Mm-hmm.
No, you need to get in their face. You need to make sure that you show them that you're tough and strong. It's like, nope, that's not what you do if you're a woman.
Huh.
If you're a woman, you play down your lack of power so that they fit into the role where they're not going to
Sure.
attack.
You live into that number 7. You be
Yep.
sort of,
Yeah.
a passive, timid woman, and they feel comfortable with you.
Yeah, and I'm certainly not saying that most of the men that I interact with on a regular basis show the worst of the toxic side. I'm just saying that it is still a very accepted part of the culture, depending on which situation, what kinds of situations you're in. It's a default.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for that honesty. How about any other of the ladies want to chime in?
I don't know how much things have really changed in some ways. They've sort of become more subtle.
Mm-hmm.
You have a group of men together, within 5 minutes, everybody knows what every man does for a living. They never think to ask the woman what she does for a living, whether she's a professional or not.
Oh, interesting.
I was in accounting, so I worked with men almost 100%. And I've had times where I was the only woman. It was suggested that I was the one who made coffee.
Mm-hmm.
Since I drink tea, don't drink coffee, I thought that probably would not be a good idea for anybody. But just the idea that, oh, you're the woman, you're here early, you make the coffee.
Yeah.
I once got in an argument with co-workers because offices have refrigerators that are bought by the employees. And so they have to be cleaned.
Oh.
And so they decided to set up a schedule for the cleaning of the refrigerator. And because I'm not shy, I refused to be on the list until every man in the office cleaned the refrigerator. I never got on the list.
Yes. Yes, I notice often in note-taking that it's often women who end up taking notes at meetings. Yeah. We had three guys talk. Would a third woman like to chime in?
I will. It's Diana.
Hey, Diana.
Hi. I was thinking when the men were speaking and when Darlene said, it surprised me because I thought, I didn't realize it was a big problem. And then when Trump made his comments about the famous ones being recorded that were public, he said it's locker room talk. And so we talked to other people, men at the time, and they all, I mean, not everyone I know, but many people said, yeah, that's locker room talk. And I was shocked. I'm like, really? I felt really naive that I didn't realize that still goes on. I thought we'd come further than that. And to hear people say that still goes on it was so sad.
All right. Well, thanks for naming those truths. All right. So this is sort of the traits he defines as toxic masculinity. And then he says this form of toxic masculinity has symptoms, right? The symptoms are sexual harassment and abuse of women by men. As Karen mentioned, the assumption that men's opinions are more worthy to be heard than women's. And that's very true in the church. Lenny himself talks about all the ways in which he has over time had to recognize that he doesn't always have the most brilliant idea, that maybe he should stop and listen for his female colleagues to share what they have to think first. One of the things he talks about, and I'm really grateful he talks about it, because I think it's often not mentioned, is the fact that men suffer from toxic masculinity as well. The physical and emotional abuse of men by other men in order to prove their manhood. I think, Greg, you were talking about this, of like that need to jump in there and like show that you're a man. And often the way you do that is by taking down other men and showing that you're tougher than them, or, you know, making fun of them. And one of the things that Lenny Duncan talks about is the way in which the Black community has internalized this patriarchy. And he attributes it to hundreds of years of slavery in which, you know, families of color were forcefully separated, right? White slave owners could force themselves upon their slaves whenever they wanted. And there was this sense of, well, a fully liberated man can just take a woman and control her. And what he's saying is he worries that that has become internalized within the Black community, of Black men saying, okay, well, then that's how I'm supposed to behave as well too. And he really wants to push back and say, no, we need a healthier understanding of what it means to be a Black man. He says another one of the symptoms of toxic masculinity is exploiting female labor while limiting female leadership. And this is very true in the church. Right? I'm grateful we have many stalwart men who serve in the church, but by far it is the women who run our congregation. And that is true in every single congregation. Every single congregation. It is the women who make the church happen. And yet women are often not lifted up into positions of leadership. And then he talks about mass shootings, once again, reminding us of Dylan Roof. So he doesn't talk about this, but I pulled up the statistics. So there have been 167 mass shootings in the US since we've started keeping track of these things. All but 3 were committed by men. It's worth noting there was one that was committed by a husband and wife couple. True romance. But to say, right, whoa, okay, like there's clearly something unhealthy going on in our society if men feel the need to go and shoot large numbers of people. And this is the state of California, 2018 homicide arrests. You can see the vast majority of not even mass shootings, just homicides, are being committed by men. So yeah, right, that, and he doesn't go into it, but theorists have talked about the way in which particularly white men, but men in general, have been told, you are important, you are the hero of your story, these are all the things that are promised to you, right? You'll get the good job, you'll get the girl. And then when those don't happen, there is a sense of rage that what I as a man am entitled to, I am not given, and I need to take it. I need to go and conquer what is rightfully mine, and it results in these mass shootings. Yeah. Okay, so he says, look, he says the Bible is both full of ways in which we can help reclaim the feminine, both in our church leadership and in our understanding of the divine. But it also, is shaped by people who themselves had internalized patriarchy. And so he references a few of these things. I thought I'd go into a little more detail. So he talks about Mary Magdalene being the apostle to the apostles, right? On the day of resurrection, it is Mary Magdalene to whom Jesus appears and says, I am risen. He doesn't appear to any of the male disciples until later. First, he appears to women, specifically Mary Magdalene. And it is to Mary that he says, go tell the apostles that I am risen. And so because of that, she is called the apostle to the apostles. And Lenny Duncan says, look, from the time that Jesus tells her at the grave that he is risen to the time that she tells the disciples, Mary Magdalene is the entirety of the church. She is the only one who knows the truth of the resurrection, and the church depends upon her proclaiming it. And yet, never once do the scriptures call her a disciple. And throughout history, she has been dismissed as a sex worker. And he says, look, if she were a sex worker, that doesn't deny her humanity or her ability to be an apostle or anything. And Lenny says, I myself was a sex worker. But also, scripture never says she's a sex worker. She's often conflated with a woman who is assumed to be sexually promiscuous, but the scriptures never actually connect those two women. So he points to that as one of the ways in which the church and the scriptures both acknowledge women's importance, but also to try to diminish it. And then he mentions that there are all these female church leaders mentioned in the letters of Paul that we never talk about. And since we never talk about them, you probably don't know who they are. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about them. So first is Phoebe, who Paul describes as a deacon of the church. But it's fun, in the English Standard Version, it's not translated a deacon, it's translated a servant of the church, right? That's a big difference to call someone a deacon versus calling them a servant. And now the Greek word, diakon, from which we get the word deacon, literally does mean servant, but it has become a title in the church of a person of the clergy. And so by choice of translation, you can either make Phoebe sound like she is a clergy person, or you can just make it sound like she's a hard worker in the local congregation. Right. So ways in which the scriptures can be used to highlight the importance of women or to diminish it. So Paul then writes in Romans, greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their neck for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but all the churches of the Gentiles give thanks as well. Read also the church in their house. All right, so this is a clear statement that these women are leaders in the church. The church is located in their home. And then in Acts, so one of them, there may be a husband and wife, but there's Apollos is speaking boldly, he's a preacher, and then Priscilla and Aquila hear them, they take him aside and explain to him the way of God more accurately. So there's the sense of a woman explaining to one of the most famous preachers in the New Testament, what the gospel really is, which is interesting, since there is a passage in Paul where he says, women shouldn't teach in church. And scholars have often written that the current theory is Paul wrote many of these passages describing churches being led by women, and then about a generation later, church leaders started going back and adding things in Paul's name that said, no, actually women shouldn't be talking in churches or leading churches. So very quickly, the patriarchy reasserts itself within the Christian tradition. And one of the best examples of that, in number 4 here, greet Andronicus and Junia, my relatives who were in prison with me. They are prominent among the apostles They were in Christ before I was. So for most of Christianity, it would say, greet Andronicus and Junio. Literally in the Middle Ages, they couldn't believe that a woman would be prominent among the apostles. And so they just changed the name to a masculine name and passed it off as a dude for about 1,000 years. And then scholars were like, oh, wait, look, here are the older texts, and it's clearly Junia. To say, right, patriarchy finds many ways to devalue women's leadership, including in the scriptures. But Lenny Duncan says, look, so there are examples of female leadership in the New Testament, and Lenny Duncan talks about, in the way that we talked about white Jesus last week, if we only talk about God in male language, then if God is male, male is God. And so he talks about the importance of using feminine language to talk about God, so that we can understand God is not a man and men are not gods. And in fact, there is a church in the ELCA in San Francisco called Ebenezer, which is devoted to only referring to God in feminine terms. It's an ELCA congregation that says, we'll only refer to God in feminine terms. And it says, look, we acknowledge God is not female, but God has been referred to in solely male terms for so long that until we have as much time spent referring to God in only female terms, people will keep thinking about God as male. There's plenty of biblical witness to using female language to talk about God. It's biblical, right? There's plenty of male language for God as well in the Bible. But I figure I'd read some of those passages to you. So Isaiah has a lot of this imagery. Isaiah 66:13. As a mother comforts her child, so I will comfort you. You shall be comforted in Jerusalem. From Isaiah 49:15, can a woman forget her nursing child or show no compassion for the child of her womb? Even these may forget, yet I will not forget you. From Isaiah 42:14, for a long time I have held my peace. I have kept myself still and restrained myself. Now I will cry out like a woman in labor. I will gasp and pant. And the psalmist refers to God as female. As the eyes of a servant looks to the hand of their master, as the eyes of a maid to the hand of her mistress, so our eyes look to you, Yahweh, until you show your mercy. And even Jesus, who Lenny Duncan says, look, I agree, biologically male, got no beef with that. But even Jesus says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, city that kills the prophets and stone those who are sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. So even Jesus will describe himself as a mother hen. To say, yeah, right, we should rejoice in referring to God in feminine terms, because the Bible does. All right. So in the same way that Lenny Duncan talks about reparations for white supremacy and slavery, he talks about reparations for patriarchy. And once again, a reminder for Lenny Duncan, when he talks about reparations, he's talking about how do you make what has been broken whole. And so he suggests a few ways. He suggests that men can acknowledge the ways in which we participate in patriarchy, right? The ways in which we not only actively participate in locker room talk, but passively allow it to occur. He recommends men listening to the voices of women, particularly women of color. That's some of that intersectionality. And then the importance of men calling each other out when toxic masculinity is in play. And then finally, lifting up female leadership and voices. But let me ask the ladies now, what ways do you think would be helpful for you, for the church and for men as individuals, to make, as you know, Lenny Duncan talked about in the earlier chapter, reparations is making an 8-year-old Black boy feel safe. What does it mean to make you feel safe and valued? in a society that has often devalued women.
I don't know if we can change other people's attitudes, but what women can do, because we have sons, we can make a difference, a slight difference, because there's the other world out there, on how we raise our sons.
Yeah.
I mean, my boys learned to vacuum. That was sort of scandalous, believe me.
Yeah.
They wish I didn't have those ideas, probably. And I insisted that my boys learn to type.
Yeah.
It's sort of strange in this computer age, but I was not about to send boys off to college who got a girlfriend for the sole reason so she would type for him.
So yeah, right. Using, Lenny Duncan talks about treating women like furniture, of just using them and noticing them when they're helpful for something and then ignoring them the rest of the time. Yeah. Yeah. And Darlene, thank you for pointing out, the ways in which women can help make changes in the world as well. Lenny Duncan talks about the ways in which people internalize their oppression, and he talked about that in the Black community. But it is true for women as well, right? Patriarchy is not only held up by men, it is also held up by women. Mothers who teach their boys, this is what it means to be a man. Women who expect their romantic partners to behave in certain ways that exude that toxic masculinity. Yeah, those are ways in which women can also participate that. And I've had women be honest with me about the ways in which sometimes they are more willing to listen to men than they are to women as well. Yeah, that internalized oppression. All right, I'll open it up to guys now too, if guys have any other ideas on ways in which we can be a part of making reparations.
Sure. Some of them just kind of like, I'm a racist, and having that conversation with people and letting them know, hey, I'm starting to learn about patriarchy and what ways and roles I, as a white male and white privilege, have been a part of certain systems, including patriarchy, with strangers and friends in our community. Specifically faith community, I think is an okay conversation to have, just as we're having these ones right here, are these types that come in and touch our hearts, in which our intellect also can be touched, in which we can share that and reach out to other people in those various ways of our intellect and with our heart as well. I am certainly a male, and I think those times too, when we speak up for things that we see with our peers and with others, sometimes those are really difficult things to do. Well, they just are. It's any kind of thing. One of the things I'm learning about my own learning is that when things are really difficult, I guess I'm learning something, and I'm growing. Yeah. And it seems that's part of the process. So me as a man, saying that I don't have all the answers, but I'm learning about myself has been, and also that about race as well, has been opening for those that I've talked to, and as in myself too. And I'll hold my seat.
Thank you, Franklin. Yeah. All right, I'll continue on then. So this is the culmination of this chapter. So after the critique in the ways in which masculinity can be toxic, and talking about the symptoms of that, and then calling us to look in the scriptures for ways that can lift up female leadership and the feminine divine, and calling us to think about reparations. He leaves us with a positive image of what the church could be if it's willing to actively strive to dismantle patriarchy or toxic masculinity. And he says, imagine a church full of young men who are able to express who they are on a deeply emotional level, who are able to admit their wrongs easily, who are able to listen to the advice of mothers, sisters, and pastor without the slightest hesitation. He says, imagine a church that brings the equity of the heavenly banquet fully to bear on the problems that a woman faces every day. And a church where Lenny's own daughter can easily see the gifts that she has, and where she is encouraged and exhorted to share those gifts with the world. He says that is a church that's worth dying for, and a church that's worth living for. All right. Well, and that brings us to our conclusion of our chapters today. Any final reflections on what we covered? And I guess my final question for you is, in what ways did having these conversations about sexuality and gender, how might they help you as you think more deeply about race and the ways in which racial oppression occurs within our community?
I was going to say I wasn't sure if I was going to say this because I feel like I've done more than my share of the talking from, but one of the things I was going to say is that I think that as women, sometimes we hold back. And when you first said the thing about the comparison with race, I was going to say, well, it's not the same thing at all. And then I thought, no, actually it is, because I was remembering reading in White Fragility about the fact that sometimes people of color are just not interested in going there with white people. They're just not interested in explaining it because they're just going to get denials. Yeah. And I was really tempted when we hit that first section in here to just keep my mouth shut because it's better than it used to be.
Sure.
So just don't talk about it. It's just, it's getting better. So just be patient and,
sure.
Yeah, anyway.
Yeah. So you realizing the ways in which you don't want to deal with conversations around sexism because you don't think you'll be believed helps you understand the ways in which people of color might want to engage white people around conversations of racism because they may not get believed.
Yeah, and sometimes not even whether it's getting believed or not. You're just making a big fuss. It's getting better.
Sure.
So can't you just acknowledge the progress that we've made? Yeah. I can see that parallel really, really easily in conversations that I've heard about race.
That's a really great insight. Thank you. Yeah.
I think that one of the places that we could draw correlations is maybe we have more of a relationship with some of these later things that we've talked about in our own lives, and we can see where systematically we've been affected by that. And then we can take that experience into listening to how somebody is affected by racism and compare some of, or at least look at what we've had difficulty with so that we can hear and listen to what somebody else has gone through, and then maybe have some empathy or listening for what we've gone through. And while it won't be the same as what others of a darker shade or a different ethnicity have come from or had to deal with, we can, by discussing these sort of things, elevate some of these places that we have felt oppressed or felt like there are things that were not in our control, that we were compelled by society to be doing things. and just maybe hadn't spoken up or hoped they would go away and they didn't, but we were directly related or directly affected by them. So then we can hear and listen to somebody else speak about how they've been affected by things we may not understand, but we can have some understanding in our own selves about what we've gone through.
Yeah, that recognizing the oppression that and the injustice that we personally have suffered maybe makes us more open to be willing to hear about the oppression and injustice that others have suffered. Yeah. Thank you. Any other thoughts on this intersectionality?
Well, one of the thoughts that I was having going through my mind was the invitation for us to look at our passivity in regards to addressing racism.
Yeah.
I think there is a connection between issues around sexuality and being passive in regards to that, and then how it is, how do we, I think there's a real resistance of privileged community to say that when they're passive about something that they're engaged in it. I think there's real resistance to that. So I think there's a connection there. I'm not sure exactly how to say it, but I think there is, how do we help people who feel totally disconnected from issues of race begin to discover how it is that they are very, very engaged in it by their passivity.
Yeah.
Well said.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if anybody's had a chance to hear about this. There's a great essay out there called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. It's about and I'll say it again, so if anyone wants to write it down, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And a lady who actually came to her understanding of white privilege, she actually started from the feminist side of how women were treated and how she was treated as a woman. And that was her gate into understanding racism. And when you talk about being passive, we are moving into the part of there's no such thing as not being racist. There's only racist and anti-racist. And those are your only choices now. There is no passive sitting back saying, I'm not a racist.
Right.
You're either anti-racist or you're racist.
Yeah.
All right, unpacking the knapsack. Take a look. Well, thank you all. So one of the things I have seen colleagues, and actually Jeff Johnson, one of those 3 first pastors ordained through the Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries process. At Hearst Church, when they pray the Lord's Prayer, they start by saying, Our Mother, Our Father. So try to include the feminine language there. So I figure, why don't we close with the Lord's Prayer, but start it off with Our Mother, Our Father. So I invite you to pray with me. Our Mother, our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever.
Amen.
Thank you all for being a part of this conversation. We'll read the next 2 chapters next week. God bless you all.
God bless you all.
Oh.
Night.
Thank you.
Bye.